My legs are 76 years old. The rest of me is considerably younger, but my legs let me down. But the rabbis sit to teach, and Jesus did, so I'm in good company. And if those chairs do get a little uncomfortable, feel free to stand, stretch your legs. Halfway through, we'll have a break, and you can either go to the toilet or go home or whatever you wish. But we have to finish by 8:30 because we have to be out of the building. Yes, Andrew rang me up just a matter of days ago and said, would I come and share? He asked if there was anything much on my heart at the moment, and I said there is one big thing that I'd like to share, and it concerns the covenants of the Bible. I'm sure you're aware that there are many differences of opinion among Christians on such things as should Christians tithe their income or not? Should Christians keep Sundays special or not? Should Christians have their babies baptized or not? Why do some churches have priests, altars, incense, vestments, and call themselves Christian churches, whereas other churches, this one included, don't have any of those things? All these are questions on which Christians are deeply divided, on which there are many, many different opinions, which keep us apart. Now, should we take these differences seriously or lightly? An earlier generation took them very seriously, even dying for some of their convictions on these questions. Today, they tend to be taken extremely lightly and are regarded as a matter of taste or preference. In a day when churches are backs to the wall, in which most churches are struggling to survive, churches get together for mutual self-support and try and forget their differences. But I believe they've got to be taken very seriously indeed, because all of these different opinions claim to be based on the Bible. And though all Christian churches acknowledge this book, why is it that we come to so many different opinions about what it says and what we have to do? Well, the answer lies in one word in the Bible, and it's the word covenant. Now, there is no difference among Christians about the meaning of the word. The differences come when we ask two questions. First, how many covenants are there in the Bible? And there are at least 5 different answers among Christians. Some say there's only one. Some say there are 2. Some say there are 3. Some say there are 5. And some say there are 7. And it is that difference of opinion that lies behind so many other differences between Christians. The second question, having decided how many there are, is the question, how many apply to Christians today? Or, as the publicity leaflet for this meeting said, which covenant are Christians under? And we're thinking of Gentile Christians, because I'm a Gentile. I wish I was a Jew. I've got the nose for it, but I'm a Gentile. And I have to ask, how many of the Bible covenants refer to me? How many do I have to live by? And it's these two questions which still divide Christians very deeply all over the world. Why are we in different denominations? Why are we in separate fellowships? Because of our understanding of the word covenant. Now, I want to begin by telling you what a covenant is, and then we're all clear what we're talking about. A covenant is a bond which binds together two parties into mutual obligations to do things for each other. But there are two kinds of such bond. There are contracts and there are covenants. And I want you to be very clear about the difference between these two, because if you're not, you may begin to think you're in a contract with God. That if you do certain things, God will do certain things for you. That's a contract. I remember a man in one of our former churches, Dodd Beatty, came to me one day and he said, David, I was in the middle of World War II and in danger of losing my life, right in the front line. And I said to God, God, if you will bring me back safely to my family after the war, I'll promise I'll go to church every Sunday. But he didn't. He came back from the war and he didn't keep it up, going to church. And then the Holy Spirit convicted him, and he came to me one day and he said, David, can I have a second bite at the cherry? I said, what do you mean? Well, he said, I promised the Lord that if he would bring me back safely to my family after World War II, I'd go to church every Sunday, and I've broken my promise. He said, will the Lord give me a second chance? I said, of course he will, but not on that basis. You're trying to have a deal with God. You're trying to have a contract with God. You'd be amazed how many people try to do this. Some people say, if I tithe my income, God will prosper my business. That's a contract. And you try to make a bargain with God. The first man to do that was a man called Jacob. And when he had deceived his old blind father and got the birthright and run away from his brother, who was very angry, he had a dream one night and he saw a ladder reaching up to heaven. And when he woke up, he said, God, I'll make a bargain with you. I'll give you 1/10 of all my income if you will bring me back to my family in peace. You can't do that with God, for the simple reason that there's nothing you have that God needs. You can't bargain with God because there's nothing he wants from you. But how many people try? I won't ask you, but I wonder if I asked you to raise your hand if you've ever tried to make a bargain with God. Ever tried? Oh, you're putting your hand up already. I'm sure there are many here who've tried this, but you can't do it. God is a God of covenants, not of contracts. So let me tell you the difference. A covenant is a one-sided bond, whereas a contract is a two-sided bond. Or to use the big words, covenant is a unilateral bond and contract is a bilateral bond. Let me illustrate. You want to get a house built, so you go to a builder and you want to get a contract with him. He wants your money, you need his skill and materials. So you negotiate, and you're both in a strong position because you've got the money and he wants the money, and he's got what you want, so you can negotiate. And finally you agree on a price and you sign a contract. And if either party breaks the terms of the contract, the other is released from the bond. Do you understand me? It's been a two-sided affair. You've both negotiated the terms. You've agreed on the terms. You've signed the contract. And now, if you don't come up with the money, he is released from the contract. And if he doesn't produce the building, you are released from your money. So a contract can be broken by one party or the other. It has been a two-sided agreement. A covenant is not a contract. A covenant is made by only one party towards the other. It is based on a promise to do something for the other. There are no negotiations. The person making the covenant decides the terms on both sides. And all the other party can do is accept the terms or reject them. They cannot alter them. Do you understand the difference now? God will make a covenant with his people. He will never make a contract. The trouble is, we think we're in a strong position and can bargain with God, that we've got something he wants. One of my favorite texts is in Psalm 50. God says, if I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you. Isn't that a lovely text? God says, if I was hungry, I wouldn't come to you. Because he said, the cattle on 1,000 hills are all mine. The silver and the gold is all mine. God doesn't need anything from us. If he is in a bond with us, it's a bond that he has promised to make, and the terms are laid down by him, and we can either accept the covenant or reject it. We can't negotiate it, because we are puny men and women, and he is the God of all. He's the one with the power and authority. Now let's try and illustrate this from ordinary life. Would you say that marriage is a covenant or a contract? Think about it. Hands up those who think a marriage is a covenant. Few. How many think it's a contract? Many more. God calls it a covenant. In the prophet Malachi, he says, I hate divorce because it means you have broken the covenant of your youth. God calls marriage a covenant. But I'm afraid more and more in people's thinking it's becoming a contract. Indeed, we now have prenuptial agreements as to who will get the money if there's a divorce. That's contract talk. The reason we are more and more thinking it's a contract is because it is ceasing to be a covenant. In the Bible days, it was a covenant because it was one-sided. The groom approached a bride, said, will you marry me? And he was in a stronger position of authority than she was. And he was offering a covenant with her. And she has no choice but to accept or reject, because it's a covenant by a stronger authority towards a weaker one. We don't think of marriage like that now. We think of it as two equals. But there are still remnants of the old covenant idea in our marriage service. Who gives this woman to this man? And the bride's father says, I do. But nobody says, who gives this man to this woman? Do they? Because it's a one-sided covenant. Furthermore, until very recently, the bride recognized that her husband had more authority and promised to honor and obey. I wonder if there's anybody here, a wife, who promised to obey. We don't like that because we think they're now equals. And I would say that marriage is now a two-covenant agreement. The bridegroom is making a covenant with the bride, and the bride is making a covenant with the husband. They both say, I will, and neither makes any terms. Neither says, if you go on loving me, I'll go on loving you. Or if you fall in love with someone else, we'll call it a day. This is contractual thinking. And marriage is becoming more and more of a contract. Whereas in Bible terms, a covenant may be broken by one party, but it does not release the other. There was a man in the north of England whose wife, shortly after their marriage, got into very bad ways, and she went from bad to worse. She was unfaithful with a lot of other men, and it ruined her health. And people said to the husband, who was a Christian, "Why don't you divorce your wife? You've got ample grounds. We can tell you if you don't know about them. Why do you hang in there?" And he said to her, "Never talk to me like that about my wife. She's my wife, and I will love her as long as I live." And she died a few years later with his hands spread over her in love and prayer. That's covenant love. It's not contract love. Do you begin to understand now? We live in an atmosphere where marriage is a contract, and if one breaks the contract, the other is free to marry someone else. That's a contract. When one person of greater authority than another promises a covenant to another party, they cannot break that. The other party may break the terms, even after accepting them. But that's a contract. It is broken on both parts. Let me give you a better illustration. Nowadays, it's called gift aid. And when you give a sum of money to a charity, you have bound yourself to give that amount of money, and the government is bound to give back the tax on that money. It used to be called a covenanted gift. Now it's called gift aid. But that's a covenant. If I promise to give money to a charity, it binds the government, because those are the terms of my covenant, to return the tax. Or let's take a better example, and that is this. The word covenant is the same as the word testament. Testament. And the word covenant is therefore used of a last will and testament. Have you made your will yet? You ought to, because whether you're my age or not, who knows who will be the first to die in this congregation? None of us. And it could be the youngest. So you should make a will. When you make a will, it's called my last will and testament is the same word as covenant. And what you are doing when you dispose of your money and property that you leave is a covenant, because you are binding yourself to give it to someone else. There is no negotiation. You settle the terms, and you could state whatever terms you wish. I leave £1 million to my daughter if she promises to marry someone called Pawson. That would be a covenant. I've bound myself to give the money. I've dictated the terms, and the only choice my daughter has is whether to accept the terms or not. She can't negotiate them. You can't alter a will. It's been made and witnessed solemnly. And that's the best illustration that I can think of in daily life for a covenant. It's not a contract. You have bound yourself to give that to someone else. You can't break that. You can, of course, remake a will. But once you have died, that will is fixed. And the beneficiaries benefit from it. They are legatees. When the testator dies, then the will is fixed. Or we might say when the covenanter dies, the will is fixed. And your Bible says that when Jesus died, the testament that he left was fixed. The new covenant was established. And we are beneficiaries of that. But it didn't come into effect till he died. That's in the book of Hebrews, if you're interested. So a death seals a testament or a covenant. Now, having given you a feel of what a covenant is, I just want to fill you with a sense of sheer wonder. The God we worship tonight is a God who makes covenants with people. Isn't that astonishing? The creator of the entire universe is willing and wanting to make a covenant with me. That is the most astonishing thing. Little me out of millions. A little speck of dust on an interstellar bit of dust whirling through space, and the God who made it all says, I want to make a covenant with you. I want to bind myself to you. And since he calls every marriage a covenant, he calls his relationship to us a marriage. And he frequently calls himself our husband. He proposes a covenant relationship with us, and he makes promises to us, all of which begin with the famous words, I will. And you know, someone says that's the longest sentence in the English language. I will. Think about it. Those of you who are married, it was the longest sentence you ever had in your life. I will. And if you go through your Bible and underline those two words, you'll find them all the way through. God binds himself to us and says, I will do this for you. Then he says, and these are the terms on which you will benefit. And he then gives us the freedom of choice as to whether we accept that covenant or reject it, whether we benefit from it or not. And the Bible is full of covenants that God has made with human beings. And they are one-sided. We don't bargain with God. We can't say, if we do this, will you do that? We can't renegotiate the terms. He promises to benefit us. And then he says, and these are the terms, but you are entirely free to accept or reject, or even break the covenant after you've accepted. But he always says there will be a serious penalty if, having accepted it, you break it. Not only is God a covenant-making God, he is a covenant-keeping God, which means that though we may break the terms, he never will. That is the most amazing thing in the Bible. If he was making a contract and we broke it, he would then say, I'm free of the contract. But he actually says, if my people break the covenant, I never will. He made a covenant with the people Israel, and he said, you may break it. In fact, he says, I know you will. But I will never break it on my side. In other words, you may release yourself from the covenant, but I cannot. And the reason he cannot is very simple. He has sworn on oath. When he makes a covenant, he's made it as solemn and as serious a matter as he possibly could. Our God is a God who swears. But when he swears, he means it. Our swearing is usually petty blasphemy. But his swearing is not. When you go into a court of law, if you're a witness, put your hand on this Bible and say after me, I swear by Almighty God that I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You know, when I watch people do that today, I think it means nothing. What it used to mean was this. You are swearing by God to tell the truth, and therefore you are asking God to kill you if you tell a lie. That's why they still use the Bible in court. But it means nothing now, does it? No. I swear by Almighty God to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And it's over in a minute. It's a horribly serious thing to do. Now, when God swears, you have to swear by a greater power than yourself, who will punish you for telling lies. So who can God swear by? There's nobody bigger than God. Nobody more powerful. Nobody who can punish him. So who does he swear by? He swears by himself, according to the Bible. He doesn't say, by God, I'll keep this promise. He says, by myself, I will keep it. Because there is no higher person to appeal to. And you'll find that in the covenants God makes in the Bible, he swears on oath, by myself, I will never break this covenant. And that is why in one of Paul's letters, he says, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation. If we disown him, he will disown himself. If we are unfaithful, he remains faithful because he cannot disown himself. There's a thought. God can disown you and me, but he can never disown himself. And he has sworn by himself to keep his covenants. Therefore, he cannot break them. We can break them, but he can't. He has bound himself to keep his side of that covenant forever. Now, having given you that very brief feel of what a covenant is, we can now ask, how many covenants are there in the Bible? And I'm simply going by the agreements or promises that God has made to people that are actually called a covenant in the Bible. And when I ask that question, I don't come up with the figure 1 or 2 or 3 or 7, as other Christians come up with. I come up with 5. 5. And I want to take you through these 5 covenants that God has made in Scripture and ask which of them apply to me and to you as Gentile Christians today. How many of those 5 do I have to live by? How many of the terms of those 5 are terms that I must accept to benefit from them? And I've made some notes for you so that you can take them home, think about them, and there's plenty of space for you to write little notes in there while I'm talking, if you've got a pen. 5 covenants, and they are all connected with people. And we give them these titles. These are 5 promised bonds that God himself initiated and totally committed himself to keep. The first we call the Noahic, because it was made with a man called Noah, whom you've all heard of in Noah's flood and building an ark. Did I see an ark somewhere behind me on this? No, I didn't. Thought I did. The Noahic is number 1. The Abrahamic is number 2, the covenant that God made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and their descendants. Covenant number 3 he made with Moses, and this is probably the best known covenant in the Bible, made at Mount Sinai after God brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and gave them freedom. He then said, now I'm going to marry you. I'm going to be your husband, and you're to be my wife. And I will be the husband that protects and provides for you, and you will be the wife who is loyal to me. The prophets later accused Israel of being an adulterous wife to God because they went after other gods. They didn't keep the terms that God laid down. The fourth is the Davidic Covenant that God made with King David. All these four are in the Old Testament and are all called covenants. And I'm going to run through those four very quickly. You can study them at home. There is one covenant that is mentioned in the Old Testament but doesn't happen until the New. In Jeremiah chapter 31, God says through the prophet, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And we look very carefully at that new covenant because that certainly concerns us. We are in that new one. But I'm calling it the Messianic Covenant because it's a covenant that was associated with the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, who was to come and be their king. So here we have 5 covenants. I can't find any more. Only these 5 commitments of God to human beings are called covenants. Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and the Messiah. How many of those concern you? How many do you have to live by? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Have you ever asked this question? It concerns one practical matter I've already mentioned. Should Christians tithe their income? Tithing is not mentioned in the New Covenant. So should we be doing that? These are very practical issues. How we conduct our worship. All these go back to which covenant should we be living by? Or which covenants, plural, out of the 5 that there are. Now let me run through the 5. You've got it on page A in front of you. Little A in the top right-hand corner. We're beginning with page A. There are 5 questions, actually, since I did this, which was on Thursday. I've thought there were really 6 questions that I should have put in. So you can write in another one. First of all, the party. Who was each covenant made with? Who was God promising benefits to in each covenant? Second question, what was offered? What did God promise to do for people under his own covenants? The promise. Then thirdly, what was expected of the people with whom he'd made a covenant? What were the terms? What were the conditions? That's the proviso. Then the next question is, what is the penalty for those who break it on their side? Is there a penalty? Will they pay for that? The 5th question, how long will this covenant last? Some of them are permanent, some are temporary. How long will this promise cover? For example, we see straight away that the covenant with Noah will last as long as the earth remains, and no longer. Other covenants will last forever. The one heading I should have included, because all this was done this week, is the word purpose. Why did God make this covenant? And you can write those in yourself. Well, now let's just run through the covenants very quickly. First of all, the covenant with Noah was made with the entire human race. And every man, woman, and child on earth is benefiting from this covenant at this moment. What? Well, I'll just add something there. I could have added, and animals too, because it was a covenant made for every living creature on the earth. So it was a covenant made with the animals as well as the human race, everything living on earth. And the reason God made this was, of course, because he had just destroyed almost everything on earth. He'd even destroyed the animals in the flood. He destroyed the human race except for 8 people. A man and his wife, their 3 sons and 3 daughters-in-law, and only 8 people survived the flood. And God had destroyed the environment. And now he makes a solemn promise, a new covenant with the survivors of the flood, the 8 of them, and the animals they had saved in the ark. And his covenant promised the survival of living creatures on earth. And of course the necessary term for their survival was food, which depended on the seasons, seed time and harvest, summer and winter. The land having a rest in the winter, producing more food the next spring and summer. And God was here promising that the seasons of spring, summer, autumn, winter would never cease as long as the earth is here. And he's kept that promise. And we all benefit from it. If he hadn't kept it, we would have no food. We'd starve. And God said, I'm going to put a reminder in the sky. I call it God's wedding ring to the human race. But he said, the rainbow is a reminder to me, not to you. It's a reminder to me to keep my part of the covenant. Isn't that amazing? When you see a rainbow, say, God, remember, as I wear a ring to remember I'm committed to my wife, God has put his ring in the sky to remind him to keep his wedding promise to the human race. As long as the earth remains, summer and winter, seed time and harvest will not fail. But there was a proviso. And the proviso was the sanctity of life. God said through Noah, I will promise to keep you all alive, but you must treat life as sacred. And in 2 ways he mentioned how they were to do this. The first will be a surprise to you. He said, if anyone kills another person, you must put them to death. In other words, sanctity of life demands capital punishment. A society that does not kill murderers has lost the sacredness of life. Now you say that today and boy, you're in a minority. But I say it on God's authority. He expected us to treat life as so sacred that if one person robs another of life, then they must forfeit theirs. It was in the 1960s that Britain lost the sacredness of life and decided no more would they hang murderers. And capital punishment was abolished in our country in the 60s. Do you know what I said at that time? And you can check me out on tapes. I said, first, the next thing will be abortion, because the fetus no longer is sacred life. And after that will come euthanasia, and we'll be putting grandma down like we put a dog down. Have they happened? Well, the first is here and the second is almost here and has already come in Europe. Once you lose the sacredness of life, then abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment goes, and those two things come in. And God said to Noah, to keep life sacred, you must put murderers to death. Second thing he said was about animal life. He said, from now on, I permit you to eat meat. For mankind had been vegetarian up till then. He said, you can eat meat, but you must make absolutely certain that the animal is dead. The life in the animal is the blood, and therefore you do not eat flesh or meat with the blood in it. He was saying you must be absolutely sure the animal is totally dead. You must not eat live flesh, even of animals. And these were the provisos he made in that covenant. Well, have we kept them? I ask you. However, when we ask the fourth question, what is the penalty for not keeping the proviso? I've put a blank. Because there is no penalty attached to that covenant. And therefore, God is still keeping the seasons going, and we are still enjoying them, even though we have lost the sacredness of life. God did not put a penalty clause into that covenant for our side. When we ask how long will this covenant last, the answer is till the end of the earth. As long as the earth is here and we're on it, we can rely on God to keep the seasons and therefore ensure our food supply. And the two things necessary to grow food are light and water. And you know, when you get water and light together, you get the rainbow. God's promise that he will keep it all going. And do you know, I can guarantee this, there has been enough food in the world for everybody in it every year. The reason why people starve in Ethiopia or Sudan or somewhere is very simple. There's too much food in countries like ours. And we're all troubled about obesity. The simple fact is, and I have this on the authority of the United Nations Food Organization, every year in our lifetime, there has been enough food to feed everybody in the world. The only reason that people are starving is us, not God. He's given us enough food. He has kept this covenant. It's we who prevent people from benefiting from it. Well, I'm getting a bit worked up, so let me move on to the next. The Abrahamic Covenant is really the beginning of the Bible, the beginning of the story of our salvation. Here is this man of 75 living in a brick-built house with running water in the house, and God tells him to get out of here and go and live in a tent for the rest of his life. Which of you at 75 would be willing to do that? In a country you've never seen. I'm 76 and I know I wouldn't. But a dear old man called Abraham, God said, get out of this country to a country I'll show you hundreds of miles away, and you'll live in a tent for the rest of your life. Whereas we try and plan to have a bungalow in Bournemouth, you know the kind of thing? Abraham was an obedient, trusting man, and he set off into the unknown. And therefore God made a covenant with him, and very briefly, this covenant had a national aspect and an international aspect from the very beginning. And God repeated the covenant to his son and his grandson. It is a covenant made with three men. And here is the amazing thing. God of all heaven and all the universe has now taken new names. He is known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Or in Hebrew, Avram, Isaac, and Yaakov. And God has committed himself to be called by three men, grandfather, father, and son. And Jesus called God that, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now then, what was the national promise? First, that he would have many, many descendants. So many that you might as well try and count the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. And second, God would give them their own land, right in the middle of the world, a promised land, which would be theirs forever. Now, I wonder how many politicians talking about the Middle East conflict today recognize God's covenant. They don't. It's not a religious matter at all. It's purely humanitarian or political. But God said to Abraham, I will give you seed, numberless seed, and this land. And they've never had it all. It stretches from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, and they've never had it all yet. But it's theirs. The trust deeds are theirs, because the land belongs to God, and God can give it to whom he will. The international aspect was that God would not only give him a nation and a land, but that through him and through them he would bless all the families of the earth. But he would also curse them through this family. So much so that God said, everyone who blesses you, I will bless. And everyone who curses you, I will curse. And there are millions of Muslims cursing Israel today. And God will keep his promise. That's what he said. Now the basis, the proviso was that Abraham should have faith, and Isaac should have faith in God, and Jacob should have faith, and they all did. They weren't perfect, they made mistakes, they did wrong things, but the one thing that characterizes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was they all believed in God. And that was enough. But there was one sign for his physical descendants, and that was that they should bear on their reproductive organs the mark of being a descendant of Abraham, namely circumcision. And when we ask, was there any penalty attached to this covenant, there was one, that anyone who refused that mark of circumcision was to be cut off from the covenant. You know, in Nazi Germany, that cost a great deal. All the Nazis did to find out the Jews in Germany was to say to men, drop your trousers. And when they discovered a circumcised man, off they went to the gas chambers. It was a costly mark to carry, only carried by the men, of course. But there it was. Female circumcision is known today, but is totally different to this. And above all, when we ask how long did this covenant last? Forever and ever. It was permanent. Let's rush on. The one we know most about is the Mosaic Covenant, and this was made, it had no international aspect, it was purely national. And it was made with the children of Israel, all 12 tribes of them, who had been slaves in Egypt, and God had brought them into freedom. And at Sinai, he married them. They went through a wedding ceremony. And God said, I will, I don't know how many times, about 100 times. And then he said, now will you do your part? And they said, we will. Now what was the promise in this covenant with Moses? It concerned the land that they were about to re-enter, the promised land. And it was the condition on which they could keep it or lose it. It was a promise that he would bless them as a nation, bless them with health, bless them with provision, food, clothes, bless them with protection from their enemies, both natural enemies like drought, locusts, and human enemies like the Philistines and the Egyptians and the Assyrians, everybody round about them. God said, I'll bless you, I'll protect you, I'll provide for you, but here are the conditions. And this is where we really run into something big. He said, you must keep my laws. You must live my way. You must live right. And how many laws do you think he gave them? The answer is 613. I'm sure you'll have heard of the 10 big ones, the basic laws, the 10 commandments, but there are 603 bylaws. And they concern every part of their life in the promised land. There are laws about sewage disposal. There are laws about their diet, laws about their clothes. By the way, I'm breaking the Mosaic law at this very moment. They were not allowed to wear mixed material clothes. You couldn't combine cotton and polypropylene or whatever it is. You had to be pure wool or pure cotton, because God likes purity. And the laws covered their marriages, divorces, adultery. The laws covered every single aspect of life that you can imagine. And God said, now these are the provisos. I will bless you. You'll be more blessed than every nation on earth, provided you keep my laws. If you don't, you'll be more cursed by me than anybody else in the world. What do you say to that? He gave them freedom to say no. He said, will you keep all my laws all your life? And they were so grateful to God for getting them out of Egypt that they said, we will. We will do them all. And God said, well, you can keep the land and be blessed in it. But if you break this, first I will bring natural disasters on the land, earthquakes, famines, droughts. And second, I'll bring human enemies who will invade your territory, occupy your land, exploit you and keep you, oppress you. And if the worst comes to the worst, I will remove you from the promised land into exile and scatter you over the whole earth. And you will live in fear of everyone else. Incidentally, the dreadful experience of Jews in World War II, which we call the Holocaust, that was a fulfilled promise of God to them. If you read Deuteronomy 28, where he says, this is how I will curse you, it's a description of the Holocaust to the letter. When people say, where was God in the Holocaust? The answer is clear. He was keeping his promise to curse them. Now that was the covenant with Moses. Live right, keep my laws in your marriages, with your children, in your life, and you'll be blessed more than any other nation. But if you break my laws, if you go after other gods, if idolatry and immorality and injustice find a place in your national life, then you know the result. the penalty. Now we know that this covenant was temporary. And in the New Testament we're told why. It was only until the Messiah came, the Christ came. And it fulfilled a purpose for God. It prepared Israel for the Messiah. It taught them what was right and wrong. It taught them what was clean and unclean. But one thing this covenant didn't do, God didn't promise any help to keep the laws. That's missing. And 613 laws. I mean, you're bound to break some sooner or later, aren't you? And this covenant didn't promise any help. God didn't say, I'll help you to keep them. But if you keep them, I'll bless you. If you don't, I'll curse you. Will you accept the terms of this covenant? And at Sinai, they accepted the terms. And within days almost, they had broken those laws. And God killed 3,000 of them within days of making that covenant. Now I want you to notice that 3,000. It's going to come up in the New Covenant as well. Finally, in the Old Testament, there is a Davidic. By the way, the disobedient would be cut off. That was the essence of the curse. Now the Davidic, with the king of Israel, God made a covenant of a perpetual dynasty. There will always be a throne of David, and there will always be a son of David to sit on it. That was the promise. Lovely promise. David was the king after God's own heart, the best king of Israel they ever had. And God said, I'm going to make your dynasty permanent with an everlasting throne. Now this also had a national and an international aspect, because the son of David would be king of the Jews and king of the Gentiles as well. Not only would he reign over God's people Israel, he would reign over the nations and be king of the whole earth. What was the proviso? None. What was the penalty? None. How long would it last? Forever and ever. Now those are the 4 Old Testament covenants. Let's now turn to the New Covenant, which I've called the Messianic, because it came through him. Paper B. Would you like to stretch your legs? Yes. Right. Get up for 2 minutes, stretch your legs.